All right, everybody, we're gonna be getting started here in a second. There we go. Gotta make sure everything looks good. Welcome to another episode of our Game Design of the Month cast, where we pick a specific topic or genre and we talk about and its kind of use when it comes to game dev. Joining me, as always, is designer on Epic Tavern, Tomo Moriwaki. How are you doing?
Guys, how's it going? Glad to be here as usual, and a fun topic as well.
Yeah, this should be an interesting one to say the least. And I think it's been a while since we did one of these. We had that very weird, awkward period. I think the holiday season and the New Year, and then everyone just got like busy for some time.
Yeah, what was our last stream about though? We did have one in January, right? And it was
I don't think we did.
uh mm,
We didn't have a round table. Let's see.
there was
It's great we can't even
well,
remember our own topics. That's we
well
talk
we
so
we
much.
talked about the Zachtronics games. Was that the last
Oh,
one?
was it?
Or was that two ago?
I know I just talked with Zach for a separate talk. Let's see. Last one was. Hope this is right. Could this be right? Was it Disco Elysium? Or
I
was.
think Disco Elysium was two ago then, and the last one
Hmm.
was Zachtronics. Maybe, or maybe the other way around. I mean, I guess yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
guess I could just take a look, but
Does anyone remember our own talks here?
well, I think it's a good kind of
Ah.
almost awkward conversation to have as we roll into talking about these games that have this awkwardness to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you are right. We did one for Zachtronics. I don't think I ever got that one posted. Oh, I'm gonna have to take
Oh, that's
care of that.
interesting.
I
Cool.
thought I grabbed that. Yeah, I think maybe I got confused with the other Zach one. Well, I guess everyone's gonna have another video to look at very soon for these discussions.
Hey,
But
if you can ever get me and Zach on the same thing, I'd be really excited about that.
yeah, you just missed them, I think, a week ago or 2 weeks ago.
Nice.
But for our topic, we said this is going to be on the subject of, I guess, quote unquote, jank games. And this is something that we really didn't see from AAA developers at all because it kind of gets at like the antithesis of AAA games, where AAA design is about being very polished, very refined. It's something that's meant for everybody. Jank games aren't. It's a very acquired taste, to say the least. So I have my own definition of what I would consider a jank game, but I'm going to throw it to you first, Tomo. Like, when we say the term jank or jank game, what comes to your mind?
Well, what's interesting is like nothing in particular comes to mind because it's not like a term that I have familiarity with necessarily. But then when we start talking about the games in the genre, it suddenly creates quite a bit of resonance actually. And so these, Bennett Foddy being kind of like the undisputed master of this space, it's had a really big, I mean, kind of a big influence, especially considering how maybe, your typical game developer might see the game as very simple and maybe even criticize some of the things that we're about to get into a conversation about what's interesting about the games.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at a kind of at the kind of level of theory, there's some really interesting things I feel like are going on. And so to that effect, this idea of a jank game is a game that kind of defies convention and is what's the right word? Like, it's not a hard game per se, because all the things we say about a hard game, at least the essence of which is
Mm-hmm.
like your skill will be challenged and you will fail a lot, but you'll learn, and once you've learned, you can overcome those obstacles. And it was hard to get to success, but once you get there, you know how to get success. That's not the case for like
Mm-hmm.
QWOP. It's intentionally awkward in addition to being difficult, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
and it's somewhere somewhere packed in its propensity to make you frustrated is where its quality or its essence lies or its message. I mean, I'm trying to paraphrase what amounts to the voiceover during getting over it with Bennett Foddy.
Mm-hmm.
That monologue is magnificent. It's a great philosophical conversation about the way we experience everything.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of gets to where my thoughts are on like when I would define something as a jank game. That he described, I think the game was a QWOP or something like that, like a game that's it's meant to be intentionally, I guess, bad or very, like I said, it kind of like gets away from what we would consider good design. And like some people may think that a janky game would be something like a Kaizo game, but Kaizo is very much about perfected execution. It is about doing one thing in one path 100% right. If you get 99.9% correct, you're still going to lose. Janky games are more about. I almost see like. If you remember like those like weird, really weird shows like Wipeout that happened like 10, 15 years ago where people are like on these crazy obstacle courses and they're getting like bounced around, knocked around. Like, you're not supposed to get through it perfectly. You're kind of, you have to like deal with the issues. It's almost like, I'm trying to think of another good example. Like somebody who like does a challenge of, I don't know, like try dancing on ice or, like those like very crazy things. Like, it's not supposed to work. I think Chris put it right there. Like, it's unstable. Like, it's not supposed to be something you can quote unquote master, or it's not really set up for that. It's like you're kind of like failing forward to try and have any attempt at solving it.
Well, and I feel like there are many kind of conventional games that end up having very, by this definition, very janky
Mm-hmm.
mechanics in certain segments of the game, and those aren't the good parts of those games, right? It reminds me of how in Grand Theft Auto 3, using the gun to shoot
Oh
people while walking
yes.
around. That is not a mechanic that
Mm-hmm.
it's not even really masterable, right? It's just a very difficult, very unpredictable,
Mm-hmm.
unstable experience, and it works out fine. I mean, one of the things it does, it makes shooting people a little bit harder. Which, if it was too much easier, you'd be putting people on the
Yeah.
ground constantly and never stopping. So it's served to it. The conventional outlook doesn't assign a value or a reason for this, but it does. It obviously does something, and it's not strictly bad. It's weird.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we really saw, excuse me, with independent games is especially, I think, embracing that. Like, I guess here's a question: would you consider Goat Simulator to be a janky game, or janky in like our category today?
Not in its mechanics per se, but I think in its kind of conceptual positioning, yeah. So kind of like at a more strategic level, it's a janky game, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's there to in a lot of ways the concepts instability and awkwardness kind of contributes to
Mm-hmm.
it it like the internal narrative that we have when playing Goat Simulator is similar maybe to the experience of trying to run in QWOP.
Mm-hmm. And I think like part of what makes it so tricky to talk about is that when we talk about like major examples, like with the Grand Theft Auto one, that is essentially a limitation of the design or a limitation of how they program the game. But what we see from stuff like Getting Over It, Jump King, Pogo Stuck, and I'm sure there are other ones. I think we even played one of those a few weeks ago. Is that these games were intentionally designed to be this way, and that kind of gets into a very interesting point about game design. Is that I know we had this discussion on the roundtable about what is considered, good game design, and the idea of like janky games, it kind of it occupies that very weird space. It's not. And I've always said this before that it's not a case of a developer not understanding how things work. It's they understand it so well that they're willing to just say, you know what, I'm just going to completely break everything, and that's going to be my game.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of these games also end up being very simple, right? Because to make it all about this, to kind of explore
Mm-hmm.
where you can find the joy in something that maybe on the surface seems kind of like the antithesis of good.
Mm-hmm.
um, I think so far, at least in the products we've seen, have required focus, and there really isn't anyone other than Foddy that kind of seems to make it their specialty. Although,
Mm-hmm.
like, what's that soccer game where it's just two people, one on each side, and you just bouncing around like crazy and knocking the ball around like crazy?
Um,
It's like maybe it's called like Super Soccer or something.
mm,
I'm not remembering these. Let's see.
yeah, I'm not familiar with that
It,
one.
it's it's on.
Lethal
I
League?
think it's on. If someone can remember, that would be the best. But let's see if I can find a Super Soccer video game. No, Super Soccer looks like a normal old Nintendo game, which was probably awesome back in the day.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, and while you're looking that up, to Soren's comment, and that's the thing, it's not really positive or negative, because there are games that, yeah, hey Ratsail, it's a very weird intersection of what would be considered a good video game.
Well, I think that something else to kind of keep in mind, and I think the analogy of idle games is worthwhile here. That it's as a type of game, soccer random. Okay, that's at least looks like what I'm talking about, but I feel like the name might have been something different. But something called soccer random would be just check that out. If you saw a video of it, you'd be like, okay, there you go. Yeah, 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 that's janky. But that it, that so much of the gamer audience doesn't really think that this is acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Same with idle games, especially at first, right? Like Ian Bogost making Cow Clicker as kind of like a non-ironic condemnation of the clicker genre, only to have it be successful and then like sort of reassess some of his positions on the topic. I think you would get a lot of that with janky games if you suddenly had all the game designers in the world start studying it a little bit, right? At first, you get a it would be like everyone would recoil from it at first. They would
Mm-hmm.
be, what's the right word? Like they would have a lot of criticisms, and there'd be a lot of uh, before they've even had a chance to analyze, a lot of hemming and hawing about
Mm-hmm.
is this even a game? And that obviously, and that I think the word obviously would come up a bunch. That obviously this is a terrible control mechanic
Mm-hmm.
and highly inefficient and very difficult to control. What could be the reason why you would do such a thing, right? And and I think it's partially because kind of in mainstream kind of social reality for all of us, uh, uh, embarrassment, awkwardness, confusion. These aren't states that we're striving to reach. um, but any emotional resonance can be leveraged to create an interesting and good time. You just have to play up the strengths and play down the weaknesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is, of course, like one of like the very weird things, like with these kinds of games, is that. Oh, and Chris asks, is it called nonsense soccer?
Well, I see something here called Soccer Random at the Crazy Games site. Now I just got to do games like Soccer Random.
Hmm.
But that's exactly the game I'm thinking of. That you have these side views of these characters, and they're basically just physics solids in the game. You just jump up and down, and you try to hit the ball into each side's goal, and it's chaotic. It's
Mm-hmm.
funny. It's hysterical as a two-player game. You can't really. I mean, you can get better than totally new players, but there's a real serious cap on how good you can get at that game.
Mm-hmm.
But it also creates random moments of hilarity and occasional great moments of like, drama or skill or
Mm-hmm.
apparent skill, let's say.
Soren in chat saying Sekiro's a janky game for them.
And no, and well, that's the thing is all the games we play have aspects that I think at first we see as problematic, and once in a while it turns out to be maybe a benefit or something charming in the experience. I mean, pretty much all of the combat in Mountain Blade is basically, I mean, at first I would have said terrible, but then in
Mm-hmm.
hindsight, it's like it all works too well, right? Once you get hooked on Mountain Blade, you are hooked on all of Mountain Blade. And yeah, your
Mm-hmm.
your mouth or your brain can criticize the combat system, but it's still an integral part. You're doing it a lot, and the game is
Mm-hmm.
so good. You can't disentangle that. So at least now you're at least in a situation where you can theorize about what it contributes. And I mean, one of the things unstable and unpredictable does for a mechanic is that it puts a pretty hard cap on how well you can do or how
Yeah.
consistent you can be in high performance.
Mm-hmm.
So like if that's not something that particular behavior, if that's something you don't want, then maybe what we're calling jankiness is something that you can introduce on purpose to that mechanic. Um,
Yeah, and that's a really good point that I was thinking about this. That when you look at something like Jump King, for instance, I don't know if you had a chance to play that one or like watch some footage of it. That the whole kind of MO of that design is that you have to make these jumps, but the game gives you no indication as to how far you're going to jump. Like you have to go completely on feel, and everything is fully committed as well. So the second you let go of that space bar, fate is going to decide whether or not you're going to land or miss that jump. And the point is that if we compare that to something like Super Meat Boy, Super Meat Boy has a very high skill wall to playing that game, especially to beat it. But
yeah,
it's also very polished. It's a game that I it knows to like the millisecond of how I push my gamepad or hit a button, how far move Meat Boy. And it demands you to have that level of skill. But with something like Jump King, Pogo Stuck, Getting Over It, the game itself becomes the limiting factor in terms of your own skill. Like a grandmaster platformer is going to still have incredible trouble with Jump King, or somebody who's really great at video games is going to fail at getting over it a lot when they're trying to play it.
totally. And there'll be the challenge ends up becoming kind of the emotional challenge relating to frustration. It's like a totally different experience. It happens to have real-time controls. It happens to have, buttons for movement and buttons for jumping or something, right? But it's not at all the same. It really is kind of a more of a, maybe it is. It's ultimately more of a philosophical exercise of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that again, just to go back to that voiceover during Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, like those words are hilarious. It's like starting over is so
Yeah,
different from just starting. You have to
yeah,
be so much more prepared to start over.
yeah. It's kind of weird because it really gets it when we talk about stuff like Souls-like design and roguelike design. That those games train you to understand that failure is just part of the hurdle, and not everybody can play games like that. As his little quote says, or as a little narrative, that it can be horrible to say to someone, "Hey, the last 3 hours that you just did, whoop, it's gone. Here you go. Do it all again."
Totally. Well, I think that's another thing too with the games like this that are successful. They aren't like loss simulators, right?
Mm-hmm.
That what you lose is actually appears to be very little. It's just this amount of time, and that to get back there is actually quite easy. Just getting past there
Mm-hmm.
is the hard part, and it's always the same hard to get past the point that you've gotten to. Even if like you do eventually learn how to kind of walk in quap, or I mean, I guess run. I mean, I guess eventually I was even able to sort of jump over the hurdles. Um, and I have, maybe crossed the finish line maybe, 3 or 4 times in my life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but to be fair, that at first back then, I had a lot of hostility towards the game, and I did it out of maybe tenacity and an interest in researching, what the heck is this? It's only after the fact, and letting the experience kind of percolate and thinking about it more, that you kind of start peeling away the frustration and finding some real intention that is really different from a lot of other games.
Mm-hmm. And I know Chris is leaving now, so see you later. But he did bring up another really good example. The kind of movement in a game like Fall Guys, where your characters are not 100%, controlled by you. You jump, and maybe your character does like a little wobble, or he falls, or he does all
Yeah.
these like really weird motions. And it's a very. I was saying this when I was speaking about Fall Guys. Like, again, we joke about this, but I've played a few platformers in my time. I've been Super Meat Boy, so my platformer cred is, I think, established. But I was having trouble with that game because I'm fighting essentially the key mechanic of playing Fall Guys, which is that jank. And it again gets back at this very interesting topic of, is there such a thing as good or bad jank? Or it's just like jank jank?
Well, no, I think there definitely is good
Mm-hmm.
versus bad, right? Bad is if you're not intending to create frustration and you do,
Mm-hmm.
then you made a mistake.
Yeah.
And that can definitely be judged harshly, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
um I'm trying to think of non-action mechanics that can fit into this mold, but I'm having some difficulty
Maybe like a
creating an
very
analogy.
poor like RPG UI, or
Or, I guess sometimes like there's like if like the rewards that you got from killing monsters was too random, right?
mm,
And now it's so awkward and unstable. Like you do it
mm-hmm.
because sometimes you get good stuff, and then that's what becomes good about it is you never know when you'll get good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But that very often you just get all manner of too much stuff that doesn't matter or something, right? Some lack of tuning, if it gets egregious enough, will become like jank, even in the context of something like a reward system.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but definitely many a game in our play experience will have a mechanic or two that's just kind of uncontrollable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just and in the back of your mind, you're kind of thankful that it's not the main mechanic. I mean, sort of Mountain Blade aside though,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a really I hadn't really thought about that until it came out of my mouth, but that's a game that I put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours into. I have swung swords and axes from horseback and run like loops with a lance into packs of horsemen over and over again, and like really working hard to kind of get good results out of it, and also just knowing sometimes it goes wrong. And and it,
Mm-hmm.
even if I said that was its 3D combat was poorly constructed the whole time I played it, I also played it the whole time I played it.
Yeah, I think that is the difference between when we talk about the jank games, like some of the major examples. Like in those games, the jank is the mechanic.
Yeah.
And getting over, you can't ignore the fact that using the mouse to try and manipulate that hammer of his is a pain. And
Totally.
there's no getting over that.
And I mean, it's interesting, right? As you invest in those experiences, you get excited that you're making progress.
Mm-hmm.
But that excitement is exactly what creates the frustration, because it's not until you have a stake in the experience that something pretty squarely outside of your control or something specific about the way the controls work connives to thwart your intent. And then you feel it. You're like angry at the game. But then
Mm-hmm.
if you do, and very much as that monologue starts talking about, if you do just pick yourself up again and get right back in there, there is something cathartic and focusing about that experience, and you do develop an expertise of sorts. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of an exercise in overcoming kind of your own resistance to things, I guess, in a weird sort of way. Let's take the thing that seems like the opposite of good game mechanics, and let's make a whole game about it. And then, so many. At first, we're all caught up in whether or not it's a good control scheme, when it fundamentally is like just a totally different experience.
Mm-hmm. And it reminds me a little bit of like some of like the more like insane simulator games that are out there. Stuff like Jalopy. There's another one that got kind of famous where again it's you could design a far better, more intuitive way of playing these games. But the point is that again, like that kind of like jank or the minutia of trying to do things. It's not just hit a button and X happens. It's okay, I need to go over here, grab the part, bring it back, make sure it's angled properly in my car. Okay, now I gotta screw it in. Now I gotta fill with gas. Wait, I have to go get the gas can. You gotta make sure that's filled. Oh, don't forget the cap. I left that somewhere else. And like you said, it's very much that idea that the mastery is both the joy and the nightmare of playing these games.
Yeah, well, and they get better once you can kind of shed your expectations of them as conventional games.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause now you can almost like, it's like if you're gonna watch a movie about Mr. Bean, right? And if you walk into that movie expecting if you're gonna be frustrated that Mr. Bean screws up a super spy scene, you're missing something, right? Obviously, you're watching it wrong. And some of these janky games, like if you get like too frustrated at failing when you get so close, right? This kind of dashing your expectations and dashing it's like it's there. It's like a horror movie also to some extent. You're like, oh, I'm looking for that. I'm looking for that scare. I'm looking for that red face that I get when I'm really thinking I'm gonna win and then I just don't, and it's not my fault. And I mean, I think it's fair to say that that is not for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, I think a lot of this is just that it's intentionally designed not to be, I guess, a quote unquote, excuse me, to be a quote unquote good game. Like, you could take something like Getting Over, like Jump King, and make a very refined, very polished UI for those games. And I'm sure, with that mechanic, you could beat it very easily. But again, does that kind of rob the game, I guess, of that mystique or that reason of playing?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to, I think
Mm-hmm.
is the best way to put it, right? It's that, because it's not fair to say that players who feel that, like, that's okay, right? They don't have to enjoy the game, and they run into an experience that just was not to their liking, and it wasn't what they were looking for. They are not wrong in having a problem with the experience. Now, on the other hand, though, for those who do find something kind of meaningful and interesting, and honestly, something that you can't get elsewhere, right? You can't get that
Mm-hmm.
kind of experience in other games yet. Maybe it'll become more of a thing as we develop a kind of more sophisticated understanding of all the ways in which we can create engagement.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I think it is definitely not for sure a bad game. That I think is too primitive an outlook.
Mm-hmm.
It is, maybe you could say, though, it is a kind of game that the smallest percentage of the audience may enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like I guess it's kind of like a weird version of like uh,
Mm-hmm.
is it the game version of Curb Your Enthusiasm? Is that what it is?
Hmm. And that actually takes me to a question I want to ask you and ask the chat as well. When I did a review of Getting Over like 2, 3 years ago, I said this is either a good bad game or a bad good game. And I guess where do you think Getting Over It lies in that? And for the chat and for people watching this recorded, like let me know as well.
I think that good and bad is tricky. Good,
Mm-hmm.
good, bad, good, good, bad, bad, bad. I think that it's a very noteworthy game. Um, I feel like I would have to do more homework to be able to maybe judge it more seriously. I do like the game, and I find it very interesting. Um,
So I gotta ask then, did you get over it when you played it? Did you manage to get
I have
through?
not. I have not.
Yeah.
I put about maybe an hour and a half into the game, and I'm getting better at doing the basic movements. And every now and then I'm able to pull off something, but I always try to pull it off, and then I often fail.
Hmm. The first I got was the orange. And for people who play Getting Over, you know exactly the part that I'm talking about.
You know, um, I mean, I guess for myself personally, I enjoy exploring difficult control schemes, and even if kind of at a professional level, I will generally judge negatively aspects of a action control scheme that um, don't have a firm connection to predictable results. Um, I think that that's like a perspective that I built making action adventure games. And so in the context of an action adventure game,
Mm-hmm.
like let's say Spider-Man, for example, like it's no one's going to buy a Spider-Man game and 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 think that it's a good agenda to have aspects of the control that create unpredictability for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so we never would know under and like 0 seconds of that entire development process, none of the design staff is ever thinking outside of that particular box. Now, to be fair, that box is actually pretty big, and there's
Mm-hmm.
a whole lot of room to inside that box to do better or to do worse. Um, at least one thing going for things like QWOP and getting over it and CLOP and grip. Um, right out the gates, it's clear that this was not optimized to be convenient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as long as you can hear that message, I think it's supposed to soften some of your response patterns to not things not meeting your expectation.
Mm.
And I
So,
don't think that they're skill action games. I really now, I mean, as time goes on, I really have shifted my perspective on these kinds of games as kind of like emotional resonance toys.
mm-hmm.
And it's just what emotion is it trying to get to resonate?
Yeah. So here's a question then, like, when you just said about these games being very unpredictable, and that's kind of what gets at the heart of this jankiness. Would you consider something like Darkest Dungeon, or specifically like high level Darkest Dungeon, to have some jank to it? Because that game can certainly screw with you. I've had that happen. I'm sure a lot of people who've played it have had those situations where all of a sudden your attacks aren't hitting, enemy just keeps critting, and now your entire party is wiped, and, hands
That's
up,
it.
there was nothing you could do about it.
Yeah, no, I think Darkest Dungeon in particular makes use of frustration and like legitimate frustration mechanics, right? Like where
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, well, the RNG just completely screwed you over, and our game supports that. And
Mm-hmm.
that this game, part of the tone and emotional resonance of this game is that things are tough.
Mm-hmm.
Like bad things can happen, and when they do happen, you don't get do-overs. You don't get to escape it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a jungle out there, and you need to act accordingly.
Mm-hmm. And I think getting back to what we were saying a few minutes ago about what is gain and what is loss is a very big point about these kinds of games, and like the idea of good and bad jank or just good and bad design in these aspects. That something like getting over it, jump king, and so on, they're very execution focused. Like Jump King in particular, I think Pogo stuck as well. You have to get the feel right. Like the game will never tell you how low to hold down the jump button or where to aim it. You have to figure that on your own. And for some people, it is very hard to extrapolate that. Like I've gotten really good at playing platformers, so I need to figure out, okay, if I jump at this specific point in a cycle, where's everything going to be around me? But that comes with having complete control. With something like with Jump King, you don't have that, and that adds that extra layer of difficulty. And for something like with like Darkest Dungeon or just staying with getting over it, when you lose, you should still have that understanding of what you did right. And it's very hard, I think, to put into words what that is. Like how would you describe, quote unquote, being a master at getting over it in the same way as being a master at Super Meat Boy or Counter Strike or something that is very high skill and also high execution focused.
Well, I think that at the end of the play experience, the games converge. They do become kind of like concrete skill games.
Mm-hmm.
And with enough time and effort, you can get, you can get real good at those games, and it becomes predictable.
Mm-hmm.
It's really kind of emulating unpredictability by adding all of this what appears to be arbitrary difficulty in the real-time controls, at least in the context of the Bennett Foddy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so by making it just like kind of like a poor match for your brain, there's just all this uncertainty and noise in the learning curve. And so that then creates all of this jankiness along that path. If you get to the end of that path, which is fairly long, I could imagine that I could probably put like another, probably another 100 hours into QWOP to truly be able to run and jump and run and
Mm-hmm.
jump predictably. Um, but it but just because that's true
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean it's the same kind of game as like Super Meat Boy or Celeste or Philophobia, like these games that are just very precise, super finicky skill challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And the best version of those games, the controls are very straightforward. You know exactly how it works. It always
Mm-hmm.
works exactly the same. It's just that the timings that are demanded to succeed are extremely tight.
Yeah.
And so you can recreate that endpoint by let's say you took the controls and made them crazy sloppy, but that would then increase the amount of time it would take to master them.
Yeah.
Now, if you add randomness in it you can practice to the point that maybe with the randomness you still succeed.
Mm-hmm.
There's all these different permutations, and I think a lot of those permutations maybe start getting into this janky game territory where it
Mm-hmm.
stops becoming the goal to be the master and rather starts becoming the goal to go through this experience that your brain is just not at all expecting, not ready to deal with right now, and you're gonna feel what it's like to go through that.
Mm-hmm. And like bringing up Tim's game, I remember when I talked to him about having that fog of war, or like kind of like the fog around when you're platforming, and that introduces that element of impreciseness to the game. And I remember like he had that discussion about whether to have it or not. And he felt like it worked for that kind of game, like introducing like that kind of monkey wrench into the equation. And I think like when we talk about like jank in like I guess I wouldn't say positive, but in an intentional sense, this feels very much like like prime indie material that you would never see a AAA developer purposely make something like Getting Over It. Or, like we said, they would not put something in that is intentionally frustrating. Or at least, again, do it like on purpose in this way and then try and sell the game like that.
Yeah, at least not in our history yet, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think that they're. I mean, hope maybe it'll be me because I at least believe in it. Creating imagine creating a significant long haul game that has a lot of non-janky elements to it, but that the goal is kind of at like a real rich emotional level that you're going to experience discomfort, awkwardness, and if it is going to be Larry David-esque, then it will be funny at least, but it doesn't have to be. It could be sad and ugly and embarrassing.
Mm-hmm.
We're not the industry isn't at a place yet where those are, reasonable goals for our audience yet.
Mm-hmm.
But we can see that like in movies and in other forms of entertainment that sometimes can be a part of the product. But in order to do that, then some creative will have to figure out a way to make it work, a way to make it seem cool and interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that's a really good analogy right there. It gets at a comment Sharky made earlier. That he sees it more along a movies that are like it's so bad it's good kind of thing. And we've seen like especially in like the 80s, I mean maybe like 70s to maybe early 90s, first time or like small movie directors making cult classic hits, and they may not have the best special effects, and they may really embrace the fact that they're low quality. Something like the very first Evil Dead or Evil Dead 1 and 2.
yeah,
That there's a difference between that and like when like a major studio or somebody who's famous tries to make something that looks, low quality. Like there's like I think like an earnest that kind of falls into that category. I think it also falls on some of these games as well. That there's this idea that developers know that this isn't going to be the best seller. They know this is not going to be the best way of playing this game, but they're kind of inviting you along for this ride. It's almost like they're in on the joke. And I think Getting
yeah,
Over It is a really good example with all of his quotes. Like again, I've said this before. Like this game was explicit, or these games are explicitly designed this way. Some people will say, "Oh, developers are stupid." They didn't know what they were doing. No, they knew exactly what they were doing, and this is the result of that.
yeah. Although that said, right, because we're also in this kind of a sort of a young indie situation, there are plenty of devs that make things and they didn't mean to,
Mm-hmm.
and they had no choice. This is where things ended up, and what can you do?
Yeah, and it's very hard. Like again, like when I do a lot of my game analysis, part of it is trying to figure out what was the developer's intention and
Yeah,
whether or not did they succeed or not. And it's hard, I think, for a lot of people if you don't understand design or don't like follow developers to really grasp at that. Like another example, I don't know if you've heard of this game. That's one I always talk about is Fear and Hunger. This was an RPG maker, like super brutally difficult RPG that you can die within like the first 5 minutes of playing and it would be entirely not your fault. Like things can just go horribly pear shaped immediately in it. And
so funny.
it's that same thing that this was not designed this way because the developer didn't know what he was doing. It was designed this way because he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and this is the result of it.
And when that's clear, I think it's really important. Like, if you want to be a pro consumer,
Mm-hmm.
once you can spot that that's definitely on purpose,
Mm-hmm.
now you can simply just judge the intent and determine if that's if that's right for you,
Yeah,
right?
and
It's like
oh, go ahead, finish your thought.
no, I think that about covers it, really.
And I think that's like what I try to get with a lot of my game reviews is that I don't often will say this game is good or this game is bad. I say this game wanted to do X. Did it succeed? Yes or no? And then I leave it up to you to decide what that is. Because I have played lots of games. Like we had our discussion last night on my quote unquote birthday stream or talk radio stream as Mojo play where everyone was on talking, and we talk about so much of the independent space. And so many indie games I've played, they're not going to be, hundreds of thousands of copies, bestsellers. They're not going to be featured on Game of the Year shows. But they're designed in a way that you can tell that the developer knew what they wanted to do, and they accomplished that. Now, whether or not it works for you or not, that's a different story. Um, Another game, what was it? Lobotomy Corporation. I don't know if you've heard of that one. That it's
What's it
kind of
called?
like, what was that?
What's it called?
Lobotomy Corporation.
Ah, okay.
It's kind of like an SCP management sim. And the developers are working on a second game, and I think they're Korean based, so so English is not their first language. And part of the challenge of that game is trying to understand like how things are translated. And it's one of those games where, again, like the weirdness and the jank are part of it. And if you don't embrace that, if you say, well, why can't I directly control my units? Or why is everyone dying so quickly? This game is dumb because of that, you're not going to enjoy it. And I think that's the same thing with Getting Over. Like, if you play Getting Over and say, this control scheme is terrible, the developer was stupid, that's not the right game for you.
You're gonna have a real tough time with the game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's kind of how idle games have gone from being just cookie clicker
Mm-hmm.
10 years ago to now like a pretty intensely robust game genre, both
Mm-hmm.
on mobile and on PC.
Oh, yes.
I think we'll see some of these other types of games, these games that currently have very low, small audiences and are more maybe noteworthy and curiosities,
Mm-hmm.
will expand out because obviously there's some resonance there. There's something there that can be very effective, and it's just a matter of continuing to explore and distill it, and then it can start finding its place in bigger games. Um, right? It has to become like a standard understanding in the creators of the time
Yeah.
before it can become like a piece of a part of the portfolio of tools. I
Mm-hmm.
definitely like the idea. I mean, I love awkwardness and embarrassment. I really like these ideas. I think that the going through those experiences when you can get over how upsetting it um, is there's some real magic there, especially embarrassment. Embarrassment when you're okay with it is just this really it's like a rich and interesting flavor. And once you can start tasting that and you can get rid of all the anxiety because you're so uncomfortable and the way our natural response to embarrassment is, if you can start suppressing that, then you can taste the deliciousness inside.
Taste the masochistic rainbow, I guess.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying is that the next time I play one of these games, I need to have my mic open so like everyone can
Awesome.
join in. I can just listen to Shark telling me to get good for an hour. Josh,
Nice.
why are you failing? Josh, just jump over that. Why are you having so much trouble?
Well, yeah, and I guess that's an entirely other facet that's worth noting is that in a social context, being awkward and messing up in funny ways, there's a whole lot of social streaming value to that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point I was going to bring up as well. That a lot of, I think, the quote unquote fame of these games have come from like streamer and YouTuber like rage compilations. Like, I think Getting Over It is like intrinsically linked with Markiplier's play of that game. And like
Very
Shark said,
cool.
like YouTuber bait, like we've seen these games, and I've seen people who I've gotten emails from developers who've told me just that. Like, this is the rage game. This is, for, wacky reactions and stuff along those lines. And I think in one part it helps to sell it, but I think on the other hand, I think it does kind of minimize these games to say, oh, it's not meant for you to play. It's meant for you to just, scream and react to and then let your fans just watch you, do wacky reactions to it.
You know what? The some prominent streamer needs to create like a Ninja Warrior like game show where he forces them to play certain games with each other, his people in his audience, and they have to, it's like two people race in getting over it, and then the person who wins that has to race in co-op, and then and while everyone's egging them on and laughing at a laugh track for every time you screw up.
Well, there we go. Let's put that show on. We can
Nice, totally.
And what you said a few minutes ago about trying to find an audience, I think it's very interesting. Like, looking at Steam right now, Getting Over It is probably the most successful of these kinds of games. It's sitting at just under 29,000 all-time reviews.
Wow, it's pretty good, yeah.
So, like, if I look at some of the other games, like Jump King, it is a little over 4,000. Pogo Stuck is just over 2,100. And I know those previous two games were picked up by YouTubers. I know Markiplier. I watch his his Pogo Stuck rage videos on that one. So even, and this is something I was talking with Shark about, that even like prominent YouTubers playing your game these days, I don't think it's as much of a slam dunk for any developers as it was like 5 to 6 years ago.
Oh, that big time. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, in some ways it never was. It's just that back in the early days, we were more kind of like, we'd hear the stories about the game that got big because of some YouTube stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's always been a vehicle for getting engagement from the users, but that won't be enough, right? The game itself has to convince people to buy it.
Yeah, and I think that gets at kind of like the heart of what makes these games a very tough sale for a lot of people. Is that it's fun to watch somebody play Getting Over It, or fail at Pogo Stuck, or Jump King for hours on end. But then if we turn around and say, well, do you want to pay for that experience? A lot of people will most likely say no. And it kind of reminds me of the discussion about roguelike design. That part of the reason why that market was so diminished for about like 20 or 30 years was it was marketed as, these are intentionally difficult and frustrating games. Give us $40 to play them. And a lot of people just said, no, I don't want to deal with that. And kind of the lightning of it with the whole roguelite genre and just more developers adopting new mechanics to it, it opened it up to say, yes, these games can be challenging, but it doesn't have to be frustrating. We don't need to hit the player over the head with a pipe to get them to play our game. And with these kinds of titles, again, it falls into that line of deal with this and next new. There you go, Sharky. It falls in line with this idea of, it's a great game to watch, but how do you convince somebody to give you money for it?
Yeah. And I mean, I think that one of the things missing right now is there needs to be some mainstream gets really big kind of game that has these kinds of elements and somehow kind of like elevates the art form to the mainstream sort of. And that may not ever happen. We don't know, right? I mean, I feel confident in that it'll grow to some extent. And I mean, my guess is that Getting Over It has the most sales or units out there, maybe partially because it's also probably the least expensive one as well.
No, I think it's actually the most expensive one now.
Oh, really?
I think maybe it was expensive because it was the first.
$8.
Really? I thought it was more than that. Wait, is it on sale?
It's
wow, I
not
remember
on
it was
sale
more money.
and $8 on Steam.
Wonder if he lowered the price. I think I spent more money on that when it came out.
Uh-oh.
Oh no. No, I really got to deal with it, right, Shark? Yeah, but that again is that part of the challenge of that is how much is somebody willing to spend for paying? Yeah, like how much is somebody willing to spend on these games? Like when I was playing that Jump King game, I think it was priced at $10. Let me see. No, it's at $13 right now. And like when I see these games, usually like under 5 is my I don't really care price. If a game is $5 or less, I'm willing to. That's kind of like me throwing a tip at a developer, and whether or not I fully play that game is besides the point. But again, I'm not your average consumer in this regard.
Yeah, no, I think that under 5 is definitely like, hey, just buy the game cuz.
Mm-hmm.
And but every game should explore selling for as much as it can if possible. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
because you don't know who your perfect, like if you only sold the game, like let's say you didn't have to worry about making money, so you sold your game at $30 to begin with, and it was a game that took 8 minutes to complete.
Mm-hmm.
So not a lot of people are gonna be happy about that. They're going to feel like it's not a good value for their expenditure. But let's say you also have a fairly unique gimmick to those 8 minutes. You sell it at 30, and now the people that are very interested in the gimmick, who are paying close attention, they're really the only ones that'll pay that much.
Mm-hmm.
But then once they've paid that much, you kind of get an idea. So these are my real fans. These are the people that are hearing my voice and they're catching the thing about what I'm doing. They like it. And then you just, and as all products kind of go now, especially with digital distribution, the price will just gets lower and lower and lower, eventually bottoming out. And then you kind of maximize your profits that way. But not everybody has the luxury to take forever to get to their maximized profits. And in addition to that, you know, interest in a product also has a shelf life. It'll tend to decay over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of complicated strategies in terms of how much you should be charging for your game.
Yeah. And
But I mean, $8 for Bennett Foddy stuff, that seems like a good choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And thank you, MJM, for the super chat there, the dollar super chat. I really do appreciate that. Yeah, and I think it's very hard to have like long-term value or long-term, high value in games like this because part of that mystique I feel is the getting over it part, is seeing what the ending of the game is. And I think it gets back at that whole discussion of, why do people climb a mountain? Because it's there. It's that thrill of, like, there's people who climb a mountain because they want to see the top of it, and there's people who climb the mountain because they just want to climb it. They want to experience it. And I think that's where a lot of these games kind of fall into, at least for people who play it.
So one of the forms of enjoyment, right, is described as fiero, and
Mm-hmm.
it is the overcoming of difficulty.
Yep.
And so these games are just highly fixated on creating that, because when you do succeed, the positive feeling of triumph over the obstacle is much enhanced. It's enhanced by all of the frustration, all of the failure that came up until that point was like charging up that moment of achievement. And so, in a lot of ways, the very best achievements are to be found on the tail end of the very hardest of games. Um, that said, not everybody wants achievement the same amount as everyone else does. Some people need that hit. They're more
Mm-hmm.
addicted to that emotional response, and so they'll naturally hunt games down that offer that.
Yeah.
Um, but
And
I don't think your average audience, for example, with respect to like co-op or
mm-hmm.
getting over it, that's exactly what they're looking for. But some of us find it,
Yeah.
and obviously it has some strong resonance for us.
Yeah. And thank you again, MGM, for the super chat. Thank you so much.
Very cool.
Yeah. And yeah, as Shark says, I climb the mountain for the masochism. Yeah, that Fiero is a very big part of why I play these games, and why games like Dark Souls and Bloodborne and Super Meat Boy is so relaxing for me. is because it gives me that period that I can just concentrate on a task, and then I get the endorphin push or the endorphin rush or dopamine when I actually finish it. When I see you win in Demon Souls after I beat a hard boss, or I see the ending of Super Meat Boy. There's that thrill of being able to just say, I did it. It's over, kind of thing. And again, like you said, it's an acquired taste. Not everybody is playing games to be, run through the ringer. And a lot of, I think, what's happened in the last 10 years have been trying to embrace both sides of it. Get people who are the super hardcore to get through a game, but also, extend an olive branch of people who aren't the best, who want to play a game that has, the story mode difficulty, or be able to give them additional assistance and get through the game without being told, haha, you suck, here's your noob hat, how dare you try and play this game, go cry to your mother, kind of thing.
And those games that have broad appeal, like you can see, they make a
Mm-hmm.
lot. They can make a ton of money. Um, it's an interesting game that trying to understand and explore the audience.
Yeah. So here's a question. Like we've been talking about kind of intentional and unintentional jank, and some an example popped into my head. I want to get your thoughts on the games by Lucas Pope. Papers, Please, Return of the Obra Dinn. I
Yeah.
think we may have talked about Return of the Obra Dinn at one point, but like his games again fall into that very weird line that they are designed to be this way. You have to comb through the whole book of the Obra Dinn to try and find what characters are. You have to look at very grainy black and white images to figure out who's who. And even Papers, Please, like the whole act that you can't just push a button to find something. No, you have to open up the book. You have to correlate or collaborate what's in the book with the past. You know, would that be considered jank? And if it would that be good or bad?
I don't think so. I
Mm-hmm.
think what that's there, like it's sort of, maybe there's like this separate category for games because Papers, Please isn't there to leverage your feeling of frustration, right? It really becomes about it's a darker, more like emulate bureaucracy and explore um, kind of the messed up realities of our world. And I think it as a result, like it uses some of those frictions to create a vibe, like the product becomes a emotional narrative that has to do with some of the really dark themes in Papers, Please.
Mm-hmm.
Papers, Please is really good. I mean, it seems so simple at first, and I'm just kind of like, oh, this is neat. Oh yeah, retro games, oh, 8-bit art, whatever. And then it just started to sink in, and I'm like, holy crap, this game is actually so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think there's a similar mechanism at play in that there is an undesirable emotion or undesirable response that the game leverages to positive effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there I've played lots of like my mind is failing me on this, but I've played lots of games in the last 10 years where part of the gameplay is the fact that the gameplay is not meant to be refined. Like we've said, like even the act of opening up a door, you could just press a button and the door swings open, or you have to, drag your mouse cursor, put it over the door handle, pull it down, push the door open, and there's that whole what's the term like intimacy I feel that these games get at. And I think even when we talk about the examples of jank that we've said over this discussion, I think they fall into that category that it's almost like like the old like Moby Dick, like it becomes your challenge, like it becomes very personal to you to get through this.
Well, I think that there's something else at play as well. If we start like kind of like thinking about why do you make someone do something to interact? And so like an example that I like is there was a shooting mechanic in what was it called? It was a I think it was like an Unreal mod, and it was called Strike Force, I think. And what it had was, it had, first of all, when you were moving under normal circumstances, the gun is like just being held at your side, and when you shot that way, it is truly hip firing and the bullets would go anywhere. And then there was a mode where you could shoulder the weapon, but you're not aiming down sights. Now this would behave similar to a normal first person shooter. And then you had to go into the aim into sights, and then you would get what like aiming down sights would be like in a normal shooter experience. And then the thing had like a 3-button sequence to reload weapons,
Mm.
um, and all these extra button presses to kind of go through the process of using the gun. And so obviously it's not as efficient as maybe Call of Duty is,
Mm.
but it's not Call of Duty is isn't about shooting guns. You happen to shoot guns because the larger thing that it's about is about people with guns shooting each other. But in the Strike Force mod, it obviously becomes all about shooting the gun. And so the kind of fantasy of bringing the gun to your shoulder, then aiming down sights, and then firing and hitting multiple buttons to reload weapons connects you with those actions and allows that kind of the story of the experience to basically spend more words
Mm-hmm.
on those parts of the story. And so to that effect now, we could describe the janky games, Papers, Please, as using their mechanics to get more words about parts of the story that maybe a lot of other games don't necessarily dwell on. And that's kind of in a generic way something that's happening.
Mm-hmm. And Rats actually beat me to asking you this question. Have you heard of Receiver by any chance, Tomo?
Receiver.
This
Take a
is
look at this.
a super niche game that is all about the
Oh,
handling and
yes.
manipulating of firearms.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Receiver as in upper or lower receiver.
And again, like it gets very much at this discussion. In a Call of Duty game, you click a button, your character fires a gun. You click another button, he reloads. In this game, you have to hit a button to pull back on the. You have to, what is it, cock the gun or whatever it's called. You have to put bullets in manually. You have to, put the barrel back in. You have to make sure your gun is properly, the magazine is in. And again, it falls into that very like weird category that again, there are 10 billion ways you could have made this more accessible or easier to do, but that would completely rob, the game of the message that it's trying to achieve.
I mean, I think you can maybe do some analysis and figure out how much functionality is too much functionality in a given
Mm-hmm.
period of time. And so maybe a game like Receiver would not require you to hit a button to go through a door. But
Mm-hmm.
maybe a game like Call of Duty would, right? It's like what are all the things that you interact with? And if your game is really focused, then take interactivity away from mundane things and pack them into the thing that you really want to get all about, that you want to be all about. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I think I'm going to start using that. I want more words about this in my game. So that's why I made
Mm-hmm.
I made the player have to do more for those things. And it's like then you might get asked the question. It's like, philosophically, don't you think that's bad control design? And it's like, well, I I think I would have said yes a long time ago, but
Mm-hmm.
more and more as time goes on, you create the experience you're trying to create. And
Yeah.
the only way you know you've succeeded is when those responses start happening more frequently to the players playing the game. And we know for a fact, like I could say, this is really about it's like a love affair with guns, but then it's just a regular first-person shooter.
Hmm.
So people hear those words, and then they those words help them to maybe think that slightly more with respect to the game. But then if you get a game like Receiver going, nobody has to hear it at the beginning. Yeah, of course this is about the love affair
Hmm.
with guns. It is obvious to me. In fact, since I'm not into love affair with guns, I don't like this game as much. But
Hmm.
then for the people for which they do
Yeah.
like the idea, suddenly it's a very interesting game, and way more so than your run-of-the-mill shooter.
Yeah. And I think what you said there is a really good point that the games that we talk about that are good examples, it's about focusing, I guess, more words or more verbs on a specific task. And you have to, I think, pick and choose where you want to do that. Like, if you're playing a game like Receiver, as you said, like, in a game like that, you expect every button is going to be applied to gun manipulation. But let's say you have to hit switches or move around. That stuff should be as easy as, 1, 2, 3 to do. Because you don't want to make everything to be time consuming. You don't want to, I guess, overwhelm your game with mechanics and verbs. And that is a really interesting. We are over. Oh yeah, as a quick time check, we're about an hour and 15 in. So I don't know, like, what your schedule is.
We yeah, maybe wrapping up the next 15 minutes or
Yeah,
10 or so minutes sounds like a reasonable plan.
yeah. But one of the games we were talking about doing as one of these series was Death Stranding, and we may have to do that at some point. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is that I feel Death Stranding fails in this aspect of good jank or right focus on words, that they try to make everything kind of very wordy, very cumbersome. The act of moving, the act of combat, the act of setting up your package delivery, the act of interacting with people, like, everything feels so grandiose and cumbersome that it kind of just like saps my will to play the game. Whereas something like Getting Over It, the whole cumbersome or the whole wordiness is, hammer is hard to move with. Here, go with that.
Totally. Yeah, and there is, right? There is a total amount of friction that any particular gamer is going to be able to handle. And
Mm-hmm.
if you exceed it, then they're going to get tired quick.
Mm-hmm.
And we definitely see how games that have almost like have so little to do that it seems like that the game is empty. Like there's nothing
Mm-hmm.
to do in this game. This game's no good. That those games can be successful um, because of their simplicity. Because players that maybe they don't like it that much, but because it doesn't overtax them, they can keep going. And
Mm-hmm.
then maybe all there is someone that there's like a character that they just think is really attractive, and then now they're good. Now I can play the game for 4 hours at a time.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess the flip side of that really is the hard limit that if you exceed a player's threshold for friction, then you're pushing them out,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not as flexible a boundary.
Yep. And I think that kind of gets at like one of the weird things. Like for me, is that you would think that I would be all over games like Getting Over It, like Jump King, Jalopy, and so on. And I always find that I just get really tired of playing these games. Like, completely different when I play something like Dark Souls or Super Meat Boy. That I get to this point where I'm just like, okay, I know what this game wants me to do. Like, I know, I know the hoops the game wants me to jump through. And then I think to myself, do I really want to spend the next 30 minutes, next 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever, jumping through said hoops? And more often than not, I'm just like, no. Like, I know the trick. I don't want to kind of like do the trick, I guess.
Yeah, I hear that. And I think there have been many games that like I kind of like really liked the idea of in concept, but then just ultimately didn't get into because I couldn't put enough time in to get over the hump.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those. What's interesting is some of those games, and I think like games like Crusader Kings and Hearts of Iron, a lot of the Paradox games, they kind of fit into this category that
Mm-hmm.
eventually I can play them, and I find that very interesting, right? And it makes
Mm-hmm.
some sense in that some of the friction starts getting alleviated because my understanding of the systems is no longer part of the friction.
Yeah.
And now eventually, since I understand the game well enough, I can play it without
Mm-hmm.
it being this punishing, kind of painful um, experience where I can't get enough in a given session to want to come back to the next session.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting parallel to what we talk about with the jank games. That stuff like Crusader Kings, Stellaris, and so on, they are very hard to get into. And part of the problem I think Paradox has had is trying to convince new people to play a game like Stellaris or Crusader Kings 3. And like you said, and what's kind of become their MO is that when you learn the games, they're incredibly enriching. These are games you can spend months playing. But the problem is getting somebody who's not already a fan to play them. And it's like a very interesting parallel to what we've talked about with something like Getting Over It. That Getting Over It is, the great equalizer. Somebody who's good at games and somebody who's bad at games is going to play exactly the same way when they start. They're going to fail. But with a lot of these other examples, there's no, I guess, room for the new player to start, growing at it. It's just basically here's everything, and good luck trying to figure it out.
I think that for those kinds of games, which I think first-person shooters are probably the best example of that,
Mm-hmm.
where a lot of players that haven't played a first-person shooter,
Mm-hmm.
they're just out of luck.
Yep.
Getting into that first-person shooter today, like just open up Destiny 2 and give it a swirl, and you've never been a first-person shooter player, good luck.
Give somebody new Doom Eternal. Tell them to play on
Yeah,
Ultra Nightmare difficulty for their first time.
yeah, and they'll be like, "What do you mean? This is a terrible experience.
Mm-hmm.
This is a I die simulator. It's impressive how fast it is."
Yeah. And
But
yep.
socializing, actually, I think social co-op, like maybe in the context of Destiny 2, like that it's a co-op game, then maybe you get into the game through a friend or something, and that friend like walks you through and shows you the ropes. A lot of that happens like in MMOs as well, that becomes a way to alleviate that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, in the context of these janky games, there's it's not necessarily room for that. It's that everyone has to experience that the dissonance with the way your brain works. These controls aren't the right controls.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think as we've said, like this is the challenge of like getting people to play these games is that you are going to fail. Like the whole point of it isn't that the experience is perfectly fine tuned. The experience is you trying to like essentially unlearn everything that you know about games to get through it.
You know, this kind of makes me feel like you make a game where at the beginning of the experience you're recovering from like some kind of serious damage
Mm-hmm.
and maybe like brain damage or some sort, and now you have to kind of relearn how to do all these basic things.
Mm-hmm.
And I want like you could like see that starts to scrape into this territory where it's trying to create a narrative experience that a larger audience could connect to, and it gives it such a good reason why it's hard. And then,
Mm-hmm.
of course, the game would also have like a lot of like social emotional aspects that are about, you know, nurses giving you positive feedback, maybe family members who are
Mm-hmm.
just very broken up about, the situation and really excited about your progress. And when you don't make progress, those family members are disappointed and sad, but they give you a lot more sympathy. And then as you start getting things together, they start getting like, it becomes a game experience of exploring kind of like family emotional
Yeah.
interactions, but now you're using what we've learned about janky games to kind of mobilize and strengthen that experience.
Yeah, that's actually a really solid idea.
It's
And like
fun. I mean,
sure
It's getting my brain spinning.
Yeah. And again, I think it kind of gets at another point about this is like it's how you present everything that I think really matters to these games. Like
Sure.
if you play a game like Getting Over It, where instead of Benefy saying something, emotionally supportive, he just says, "Why do you suck so much? You're just an idiot at this game." A lot of people that wouldn't resonate with a lot of people, and it is very much this package of how you deliver these elements. Like again, like going back to like the jalopy example, and there's another one I forget the name of, that that intimacy that you build up with how you play the game is as important as playing the game itself. Because like we said, anyone could take these examples that we've talked about and make the most polished, the least wordy version of them. But that would kind of rob it of that personal feel to it. Like when you, like again, like going back to the Call of Duty receiver example, when you pull a gun in Call of Duty, you don't really think about that. You're thinking about that guy you're trying to headshot 30 feet away. In receiver, when you pull the gun, you are thinking about everything that you just did to get the gun to that point and the sheer thrill of actually getting it to fire.
Oh, like a baby version of that is active reload for Gears of War.
Mm-hmm.
At first, you're like, "What is this?" And then eventually it became just magical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to Juan's comment in chat, that's a very interesting topic. That may be beyond what we can get into today, but the idea of intentionally ribbing the player when they're playing a game like that. Because like for me, I like it. Like I've played games where they'll say all kinds of weird things. I remember like Rocky and Bullwinkle, where the game says, "I hope you don't die here," and you have to restart our entire game from the beginning. And I just wanted to scream at the screen at that developer is saying that. But there are people who don't like a game that is throwing salt on the wound. Like the pain or the punishment of death is enough. You don't need to kick them when they're down. Throw sand in their eyes, and then belittle them on top of that.
Yeah, obviously, there's plenty of people that are like, yeah, why would I ever want that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, from my personal experience, the reason why I want it is because I want to experience broader amount of stuff. And in the
Mm-hmm.
context of a game, it's also harmless, so you get to really feel it. And then, like, really, with horror movies and like super weird movies, like psychedelic movies, time travel movies,
Mm-hmm.
they explore like the edges of our perception, right? And as long as you're open to it, it can be a really fun experience to kind of just browse something that isn't normally in your kind of like wheelhouse, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And to Soren's comment, the same thing. Like when you play Call of Duty, you have millions and millions of bullets you're going to be shooting in that game. In something like receiver, you may just have 6 on you. And you like in Deadpool, you better make every one of those bullets count. And you become very well acquainted with the act of thinking about how many times you fired your gun in the last minute.
Yeah. Although in a lot of cases, right, just the general way of the game or the meta of the game is that you shoot, you kill, you reload, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just a part of this pattern. Um, some players who are kind of getting into min-max territory maybe count their bullets a little bit better than others, and sometimes like at a higher level of play, it's like I really want to be accurate enough so that I can expend less than a third of my magazine to kill this person, so
Mm-hmm.
that I can then expend a third of my magazine to kill this person, and then spend the rest of it to kill this person in this like 3-kill streak of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, people don't get an opportunity to practice those kinds of skills in those games, just because it is noisy. It's about the craziness. Everyone kind of running around, dying quickly, you getting shot from where you don't know, learning where the level, learning how the level works, so you stop standing out in the open over there.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about that, like this is one that always throws me off when I play shooters. That when you reload, you lose all the ammo in the gun that's in there. So you have to wait until like the very end to reload. That
Yeah.
wrecks my brain every time I play a shooter that does that. Because I am that guy that the second I shoot one bullet and I have downtime, I'm reloading my gun. Like I don't want my gun to ever not to always be filled.
You know, it's kind of funny. That reminds me of some of the stuff we were doing on Medal of Honor in 2010. We were so fixated on authenticity and realism. We were trying to puzzle over how to
Mm-hmm.
make it so that you could do two types of reloads. One would be a reload that took longer, and then you would see that they would take the magazine and like stow it before putting in the
Mm-hmm.
next magazine. Um, and then the other is, high speed. You're dropping what's there, you're going to
Mm-hmm.
lose what's there, and you're going to put that other magazine in as quickly as possible to get back into shooting. Um, and it was a lot of conversations. We had demonstrations by consultants showing how they might reload and pull out partial magazines to put back in
Mm-hmm.
if they're because bullets do matter. In fact, generally speaking, I guess from what I hear, you never waste the bullets in a magazine, ever.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, yeah, in real life that makes sense. But for sure, we know in a game that I'd take a quarter second to get those bullets flying again, because that often can mean the difference between a win and a loss in that
Mm-hmm.
face-off in multiplayer shooter.
Yeah, and we've seen like I think this will be my final point. Then I'm fine with just like kind of summarizing and wrapping things up.
Sounds
That
good. Sounds good.
we've seen multiplayer games really tried. Some of them have tried to embrace that level of authenticity, and we could argue that level of jank that comes with it. So like Red Orchestra would be a good example,
Yeah.
where you're not supposed to just be running and jumping and shooting your gun. One bullet is often enough to kill you. And I think, as with everything we've said over the course of this discussion, it is very much an acquired taste. Like, I hate to throw more questions, but this will be my official last one. Do you think a game like Getting Over It would be appealing to new people? Like, if you've never played a video game before, if you have a family member who's never touched something, do you think giving them a copy of Getting Over It would be a good game for them? Like they have
I know.
no preconceptions.
So I think any of my family members who are kind of gamers
Mm-hmm.
probably would not, because
Mm-hmm.
they've already been cooked to have certain expectations. But some of my family members who've never played games might very well enjoy it, especially with that freaking voiceover.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, I don't, it was really hard. Was it supposed to be hard? I know I'm not very good at games, but I really couldn't get anywhere. But I really found what he was saying very interesting.
All right. So, do you have any final thoughts or topics before we kind of like summarize things up and wrap it up for tonight?
You know, I don't have any more thoughts about the janky games, but I think in the course of this stream, I feel like we should. Oh, I'm forgetting. I'll think about it more. But there was a topic that kind of seemed like it came up that I think should be a topic for us in the future, and it'll be a lot of fun to talk about. So I just have to remember what that is now.
Uh oh. Well, hopefully you do. But I guess for those of you watching, to kind of summarize our talk, that when we talk about jank in this capacity, it's really about adding more words or adding more verbs to a mechanic. It's about, becoming very focused on a singular task, whether it is, stamping passes in a booth in Papers, Please, using a hammer or mallet to get over a mountain, pogoing up some crazy esoteric device. And it is a very much an acquired point. And bad examples of this are when developers do these things unintentionally, or they try and make everything janky, where it's not as laser focused. And for games like Getting Over It, Jump King, Pogo Stuck, Receiver, and so on, they are, again, explicitly designed to be this way. Now, whether or not you like it or dislike it is kind of besides the point. These games were not meant, or these games were not designed to be mistakes. And part of the challenge, I think, of how this market will grow is trying to explain that to someone, to tell them it's not you that's failing. This is just what this game is. Do you like it? Yes, then keep playing it. No, then maybe you should return, because you're not going to. What, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. Like, if you're complaining, if you want orange juice and somebody gives you grapefruit juice, you can't scream at them and say, "Why, why does this grapefruit juice not taste like an orange?"
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, yeah, the essence, even though it goes far beyond the concept of just the janky games we were talking about originally, I do think that that is the essence of it, right? That
Mm-hmm.
that they're exploring certain experiences that are off the beaten path for the
Mm-hmm.
the mainstream of the audience, and I think the audience is responding or recoiling from the games for those reasons. But that they're making the janky game uses is trying to create frustration. It's
Mm-hmm.
trying to create a path full of obstacles and difficulty to then change an overall, like a path, a conventional action path. Then some of the other games we were talking about, right? They're just exploring different kinds of emotion
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes we might consider strictly negative, and from a mainstream standpoint, especially so, right? It's like it. Your mainstream audiences don't need a whole bunch of Watership Down necessarily.
Mm-hmm. I think what we need to do at some point is that the next time I play one of these games, I need to have you on as commentator, like a benefati for any one of these titles.
Like, you can feel it, can't you?
Mm-hmm.
Restarting is so much more difficult than just starting.
Well, the best
Everything
part,
you've done, all that effort, just thrown into the trash. How does that make you feel?
no, I think the best was I get Shark on. It'll be like the angel and the devil. Like Tomo will be the calm, philosophical one. Charles will be like, "You suck, Josh."
Just throwing water balloons at your head the whole time.
Yeah, there we go. I think we got it right there. All right, but we could certainly sit here and chat for a few more hours, but I know you have to get going, and of course, you have to work on Epic Tavern. So, as always, for people watching, any social media, anything you would like to plug, go right ahead.
So yeah, Hyperkinetic Studios has one internal project. It is a game called Epic Tavern. It's on Steam Early Access. We've been there for quite a while. We're trying desperately to get out of early access as soon as possible. So we hope that'll happen sometime this year. And you can find us. We stream development 3 times a week on Twitch at twitch.tv/Epic Tavern. At our Discord channel, discord.gg/Epic Tavern. We have twice a week dev chats where we dialogue with our audience. And of course, at the Discord channel, we talk about all things relating to Epic Tavern, storytelling, and game development.
Awesome. And thank you, Chris. And we do, of course, we have multiple game developer interviews each month. If you are a developer working on a game or want to talk design and want to come on, please get in touch. We also do our monthly game dev roundtables along with Shark, Ramin, and a few other guests, depending upon who's available. So be sure to look for that, usually the third or fourth week of each month. And if you have a topic or game you would like us to discuss for these talks, please let us know in the comments. And I guess very last point for those of you watching live or recorded, are there any other examples of like really solid quote unquote janky games that we didn't mention? Let us know in the comments and we'll see if we can check those out because they are out there. But trying to learn about them on your own can be very difficult.
The industry's gotten too big. There's so
Oh,
much out there
yes.
to explore.
Oh, yes. So, with that, I'll be back for my regular game stream later tonight. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.
Thanks, everybody.